The blizzard that swept across the Montana Territory in 1889 didn't just bring snow, it brought a secret, whispered on the wind. A secret that would force a lone woman to choose between her own life and that of a child left to die. This isn't just a story of survival against the odds. It is the incredible true account of Hazel, a homesteader who found an abandoned baby in the frozen wilderness and in saving him, challenged the ancient laws of a mysterious hidden people. The choice she made, the battle she fought, and the unbelievable honor they bestowed upon her in the end will change everything you think you know about the untamed West. The wind was a living thing. It had teeth that bit at the chinking of Hazel's cabin and a voice that moaned with the loneliness of 1,000 empty miles. For 3 days, the world beyond her single pane of glass had been a churning vortex of white. The blizzard of '89, they'd call it later, in the scattered settlements of the Montana Territory, a storm that buried fences, smothered livestock, and erased the very memory of the land beneath a deep and unforgiving shroud. For Hazel Sullivan, the storm was both a prison and a shield. At 28, she had already lived a life too full of noise of people, of the suffocating expectations of Boston society. A life that had ended in a flash of betrayal and grief, sending her fleeing westward in search of a silence so profound it might finally quiet the echoes in her own soul. She had found it here, in this high, remote valley, nestled in the shadow of the Beartooth Mountains. She had her small, sturdy cabin, a well-stocked larder, a barn with a single milk cow, and a handful of chickens, and the loyal companionship of her dog, Bodie, a scruffy grey mutt with the heart of a lion. It was a Spartan existence, but it was hers. On the 4th day, the wind's howl softened to a weary sigh. The snow stopped. A pale, milky light seeped into the cabin, revealing a world transformed, sculpted into strange, sweeping dunes of white. The silence that followed was immense, almost holy. Hazel pulled on her heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped her face in wool, and strapped on the bare-paw snowshoes her neighbor, a grizzled old trapper named Jedediah, had helped her make. She had to check on her animals and dig out the well. Body, sensing the expedition, danced at the door, his tail a frantic metronome of joy. As Hazel pushed the heavy plank door open, a wall of snow drifted halfway up the frame, cascaded inwards. It took her the better part of an hour to dig a narrow trench to the barn, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The cow was safe, lowing her displeasure at the confinement, and the chickens were huddled but unharmed. It was on her way back from the barn, a bucket of milk in one hand and an axe in the other, that she heard it. At first, she thought it was the wind, a trick of the newly formed drifts, a thin, high-pitched cry, almost like a bird. But there were no birds. Body heard it too. He froze his head, cocked the fur on his neck, bristling. His low growl vibrated in the stillness. "What is it, boy?" Hazel whispered, her eyes scanning the alien landscape. The cry came again, sharper this time, desperate. It was a sound that had no place in this vast frozen emptiness. It was the sound of a baby. Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs. It was impossible. The nearest homestead was a full day's ride east, and the town of Red Lodge was a hard 3-day journey south. No one could be out in this. No one could have survived. A part of her, the rational part that had learned the cruel laws of the wilderness, screamed that it was a phantom allure. Mountain cats were known to mimic the cries of infants to draw in prey. But Body wasn't looking toward the rocks of the high ridges. He was staring intently at a large snow-covered mound, 50 yards from the cabin, a place where a thicket of stubborn hawthorn usually stood. He whined a sound of profound confusion and distress. Driven by an instinct older than reason, Hazel left the milk bucket and started towards the mound, her snowshoes making a soft, crunching rhythm in the snow. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the immense silence. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, but that thin, wavering cry, weaker now. As she drew closer, she saw a patch of color against the white, a deep, rich crimson, barely visible. It was a piece of woven fabric, intricately embroidered with patterns of blue and yellow. It was snagged on a hawthorn branch that poked through the snow. Below it, the snow was disturbed not by drifting, but as if it had been deliberately piled. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. A wagon train lost and buried. A traveler who had succumbed to the storm. She dug frantically with her mittened hands, the cold biting at her fingertips. Body began to dig alongside her, whining with an urgent pitch. The snow gave way to something soft. Not the unyielding hardness of a frozen body, but yielding layers of hide. Reindeer hide, she realized with a jolt of confusion. It was exquisitely tanned and impossibly soft. She'd seen pelts like it once, traded by a mysterious group of northern people who passed through Red Lodge a year ago, people the locals called the Laps. She pulled the hides back, layer after layer, her breath held tight in her chest. And then she saw him, a baby, impossibly small, nestled in a cradleboard unlike any she had ever seen. It was carved from a single piece of light-colored wood and adorned with the same vibrant symbols as the cloth. The child was wrapped in fine, soft furs, its face pale and still. For a terrible moment, she thought she was too late. But then a tiny chest rose and fell in a shallow, stuttering breath. The baby's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, fluttered open. They were almond-shaped, tilted, and held a depth that seemed ancient. The skin was a beautiful shade of cream, and a wisp of jet-black hair lay plastered to its forehead. This was no child of the homesteaders or the crow people who sometimes passed through the valley. This was a child of the people who worked with reindeer. A Sámi child. Who could do this? Who could leave a helpless infant in a snowfield to die? It was an act of such profound cruelty, it defied comprehension. Yet there was a strange deliberation to it all. The cradleboard was placed in the relative shelter of the thicket. The layers of hide were thick and warm. It wasn't the act of someone discarding a child in a panic. It felt ceremonial, ritualistic. The thought sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She gently lifted the cradleboard. It was surprisingly light. The baby let out another weak cry, a sound of pure misery. He was starving, freezing, but by some miracle, he was alive. Clutching the cradleboard to her chest, Hazel turned and stumbled back towards the cabin, her mind a whirlwind of fear and fury. Body trotted at her heels, nudging her hand with his wet nose as if to offer encouragement. She had just saved a life, but as she barred the heavy door behind her, shutting out the vast, silent judgment of the snow, she had a chilling premonition. She hadn't just found a baby, she had stolen something, and the people who had left him there would surely come to get him back. The warmth of the cabin was a shock after the biting cold. Hazel worked with a focused urgency, her movements swift and sure. She placed the cradleboard on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth where a low fire still glowed. The baby was terrifyingly quiet, now his energy spent. She unwrapped him from the furs, her hands clumsy, with a mixture of awe and fear. He was a boy, tiny and fragile, but perfectly formed. His skin was cold to the touch, a dangerous marbled blue creeping into his tiny fingers and toes. On his chest, tied with a leather cord, was a small, intricately carved amulet of bone shaped like a hammer. She left it in place, sensing its importance. Panic began to prick at the edges of her composure. What did she know of babies? Hers was a world of mending fences and milking cows, not nursing infants. She thought of her sister back in Boston, of the effortless way she had soothed her own children. That world had never been hers. "All right, little one," she murmured, her voice shaky. "Let's get you warm first." She filled a basin with lukewarm water from the kettle and gently, carefully began to sponge his small body, talking to him all the while, the sound of her own voice, a strange comfort in the charged silence. He was so still, too still. She wrapped him in the softest linen she owned and held him close to her own body, trying to transfer her warmth to his. She rubbed his tiny limbs, trying to stimulate the circulation, her heart aching with every passing second. He remained so passive. Then came the question of food. He was too weak for the cow's milk, that much she knew. It would be too rich, too harsh. She needed a substitute, and she needed it now. She remembered a remedy Jedediah had once described for saving newborn lambs whose mothers had rejected them: a mixture of water, a little sugar for energy, and a drop of whiskey for warmth. It was a desperate gamble, but it was all she had. With trembling hands, she mixed the concoction. She dipped the corner of a clean cloth into the sugary liquid and gently touched it to the baby's lips. At first, there was no response. She tried again, squeezing a single drop onto his tongue. A flicker of movement. His mouth worked a weak, searching motion. Hope surged through her, fierce and bright. She dripped more of the liquid into his mouth, drop by painstaking drop. He began to swallow, a tiny convulsive movement in his throat. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. For an hour she sat there, feeding him, warming him, murmuring nonsense to him. Color slowly began to return to his cheeks. His breathing deepened, becoming more regular. Finally, his stormy gray eyes opened and looked right at her. There was no comprehension there, only a raw, primal need. But for the first time, Hazel felt a connection, a bond forged in the crucible of the storm. "I'll call you Niels," she whispered the name of her own father, a man of quiet strength. "It means champion. You are a champion, little one. You survived." As the afternoon wore on, a new kind of fear began to settle in her heart. The fury at the parents had given way to a chilling question: why no one, not even the most desperate, could leave a child to such a fate without a powerful reason. The deliberate nature of the placement, the ceremonial feel of the cradleboard, and the amulet, it spoke of tradition, not malice. A tradition so alien and terrifying she couldn't begin to fathom it. Her small cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a glass cage. Every shadow that danced on the wall seemed to hold a threat. Every creak of the logs settling was the sound of an approaching footstep. The Sámi. She knew so little about them. They were nomads, living in the highest, most inaccessible parts of the mountains, following their reindeer herds. They kept to themselves, trading silently in town once or twice a year before melting back into the wilderness. They were a people of rumor and myth, said to possess ancient magic, to speak with the spirits of the land. And she had taken their child. By nightfall, Nils was sleeping soundly in a makeshift crib she had fashioned from a wooden crate lined with her softest woolens. The cradleboard stood against the wall, a silent, ornate sentinel. It was a beautiful object, but looking at it filled her with dread. It was a link to the people who would come. Not if, but when. She spent the night in the rocking chair, a loaded shotgun resting across her lap body at her feet. She didn't sleep. She watched the fire dance and listened to the soft breathing of the baby. She was no longer just Hazel Sullivan, the woman hiding from her past. She was a guardian. The weight of this tiny soul was now hers to carry, and she found to her own surprise that she could not give it up without a fight. 3 days passed in a haze of anxiety and newfound routine. Nils grew stronger with each passing hour. Hazel, using a carefully diluted mixture of cow's milk and water, fed him every few hours. She learned the cadence of his cries, one for hunger, another for discomfort. A fragile domestic peace settled over the cabin, a bubble of warmth and life in the vast, cold emptiness. But the emptiness was watching. On the morning of the 4th day, Bodhi began to growl, a low, constant rumble from deep in his chest. He stood at the door, his body rigid, staring out into the brilliant, sun-drenched snow. Hazel's blood ran cold. She peered through the small window. They had come. There were 3 of them standing about 100 yards away, their figures dark and stark against the blinding white. They weren't on horseback. They stood beside strange, low-slung sleds, pulkas. She later learned they were called, each pulled by a single, magnificent reindeer. The animals were huge, with massive velvety antlers, their breath misting in the frigid air. The people were dressed in layers of hide and vibrantly colored wool, the same deep crimsons and blues as the cloth she had found. 2 were men, broad-shouldered and weathered, their faces framed by dark beards. The 3rd, standing slightly behind them, was a woman. Even from this distance, Hazel could feel the intensity of their gaze. They weren't looking at the cabin. They were looking at her. They made no move to approach, simply stood there, silent and implacable as the mountains behind them. It was a test, a display of power. They could have surrounded the cabin in the night, but they chose to reveal themselves this way in the full light of day. It was a statement of honor, and a terrifying one at that. Hazel's hand went to the shotgun leaning against the wall. Her first instinct was pure frontier defiance. This was her land, her home. But as she looked at them, at the quiet dignity of their stance, at the majestic beasts standing patiently beside them, she knew that a shotgun would be a fool's answer. This was not a problem that could be solved with violence. This was a negotiation for a soul, and the currency was something she did not yet understand. Taking a deep breath, she unbarred the door. She would meet them. She would not hide. She was the champion of Nils, and she would face his people. She stepped out into the cold, bright morning, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest, and walked toward the 3 silent figures and their reindeer. The snow squeaked under Hazel's boots, the only sound in the unnervingly silent standoff. As she drew closer, the details of the 3 figures sharpened, and her apprehension deepened. The man at the forefront was clearly the leader. He was older, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by wind and worry, his beard streaked with gray. His eyes, however, were sharp and black as obsidian, and they watched her approach with an unnerving, unblinking intensity. He held a long, carved staff of birchwood. This was a man of authority, of unshakable conviction. This was Aslak. The second man was younger, broader, his expression a sullen mask of hostility. He was pure muscle and suspicion. But it was the woman who drew Hazel's gaze. She was younger than Hazel, perhaps only 20, with a long, dark braid that fell over her shoulder. Her face was beautiful, but etched with a profound sorrow that seemed too heavy for her years. Unlike the men, her eyes were not on Hazel, but flickered constantly toward the cabin, a mixture of longing and terror in their depths. This was Britta. Hazel stopped about 20 feet away, a distance that felt both respectful and defensible. She kept her hands visible, away from her coat pockets. "I mean you no harm," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The older man, Aslak, spoke. His voice was a low rumble, the English words heavily accented but clear. "You have something that does not belong to you." It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. "I found a child," Hazel countered, her chin held high. "Left to die in the snow. I brought him in. I saved his life." A flicker of something annoyance, contempt crossed Aslak's face. "You saved nothing. You interfered with the will of the Sajvi, the spirits of the mountain. You have broken the balance." The younger man spat on the snow. "She is a Ristan Gadzi," he growled, "a Christian outsider." The word was an epithet. Hazel ignored him, keeping her focus on Aslak. What kind of will leaves a baby to freeze to death? What kind of spirit demands such a sacrifice? "It is not a sacrifice," Aslak said, his voice laced with a cold fury. "It is a test, a sacred tradition, older than these mountains. The child was born incomplete, marked by a shadow. We give such children to the mountain for one cycle of the sun. If the spirits find them worthy, if their own inner fire is strong enough to survive, they are returned to us, cleansed and whole. They become our greatest seers, our strongest leaders. If they do not survive," he finished, his gaze sweeping over the vast, indifferent landscape, "then their spirit is released to the wind, unburdened by a flawed vessel." Hazel stared at him horrified. It was worse than she had imagined. Not cruelty, but a chilling, ritualistic logic that was completely alien to her. "Incomplete. I've held him, I've fed him. He is a perfect, healthy baby boy." "You see with outsider eyes," Aslak dismissed. "You see only the flesh. You do not see the soul." It was the woman Britta who spoke, then her voice a fragile whisper. "He has a small mark on his foot, the shape of a crescent moon." Aslak shot her a look of pure venom, and she flinched, lowering her eyes to the snow. The information had slipped out, an involuntary betrayal. "A birthmark?" Hazel asked, incredulous. "You would leave a child to die for a simple birthmark?" "It is not a birthmark. It is a sign, an omen." Aslak boomed, striking the butt of his staff on the hard-packed snow. "Our way is not for you to understand. Give us the boy. We will return him to the mountain and complete the ritual. It is the only way to appease the spirits you have angered." The air crackled with tension. Hazel's heart pounded. Return Nils to the snow, to that certain death. The thought was monstrous. The protective instinct that had bloomed in her roared to life. "No." The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. The younger man took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. Aslak held up a hand, stopping him. The elder's eyes narrowed, a dangerous light glinting in their depths. "You are one woman, in a wooden box. Your well can be fouled. Your food can be spoiled. The winter is long, and the mountain has many ways to claim what belongs to it," he said, his voice dropping to a soft, menacing promise. "We are the Sámi. This is our land. You are the guest here, a guest who has stolen from her hosts. Give us the boy." It was a threat, cold and clear. He was telling her they would not use overt violence, but a slow, creeping siege, a war of attrition, a war she could not possibly win. Hazel's mind raced. She looked from Aslak's fanatical certainty to the younger man's brute hostility. Then her eyes settled on Brita. The young woman's face was a mask of misery. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and when she briefly met Hazel's gaze, her eyes were pleading. But what was she pleading for? For Hazel to relent, or for her to stand strong? He is not a thing to be given. Hazel said, her voice shaking but resolute. He is a human being, and he is safe with me. If you want him, you will have to kill me to get him. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the huffing of the reindeer and the distant sigh of the wind. Aslak stared at her, his expression unreadable. He had not expected this. This solitary woman, with her strange defiance, was an unexpected snag in the ancient tapestry of his traditions. Finally, without another word, he turned. He gestured to the other man, and they moved to their sleds. Brita cast one last anguished look at the cabin before turning to follow. They climbed onto their sleds, and with a soft command, the reindeer pulled them away, moving with a silent, fluid grace across the snow. In moments, they were gone, leaving only the tracks of their runners and the faint, musky scent of the animals. Hazel stood watching until they were specks in the distance, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and triumph. She had won the first battle, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Aslak had been right. The war was just beginning. Over the next week, the war began. It was a campaign of nerves, of subtle, unnerving acts. One morning, she found a bundle of black raven feathers tied to her door latch, a symbol of ill omen. Another day, the water from her well tasted bitter, and she found it had been tainted with a foul-smelling lichen. She was forced to melt snow for water, a laborious, time-consuming task. Her small stack of firewood, painstakingly gathered and cut, disappeared in the night, leaving her to scour the frozen woods for more. She felt constantly watched. Sometimes, at the edge of the woods, she would catch a flicker of crimson cloth or see a figure melt back into the trees. They never showed themselves fully, never confronted her. They were ghosts, applying a relentless, silent pressure. The loneliness she had once craved now felt menacing. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was filled with unspoken threats. Her only solace was Nils. Caring for him gave her purpose, a reason to fight. He was thriving. He had started to smile, a gummy, heart-melting grin that lit up his whole face. He would grip her finger with surprising strength, his stormy eyes following her as she moved about the cabin. The love she felt for him was a fierce, protective fire that burned away her fear. But the strain was taking its toll. Her nights were sleepless, spent listening for any sound. Her days were a frantic cycle of chores and vigilance. She was growing weary, and she knew that was their plan. One afternoon, a week after the confrontation, she was chopping wood near the tree line when she heard a soft snap of a twig behind her. She spun around, her axe held ready. It was Brita. The young Sámi woman stood alone, without a sled or reindeer, her face pale and frightened. She held up her empty hands as a sign of peace. "I should not be here," Brita whispered, her eyes darting nervously towards the mountains. "If Aslak knew, why are you here?" Hazel asked, her voice wary but less hostile than it would have been a week ago. "The child, Nils, you call him?" Brita asked, a softness in her voice. Is he well? He is, Hazel said. He is strong. A look of profound relief washed over Britta's face. Aslak tells the others that the spirits are angry, that the child grows weak, cursed by your interference. He says you are a dark witch holding the boy's soul captive. And what do you believe? Hazel pressed. Britta looked down at her feet, then met Hazel's gaze, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I believe you have a good heart, but you do not understand. Aslak is not just a cruel man. He is afraid. Our people, we are few. We have lost so much. Our lands in the old country, our language, our way is fading. These traditions are all he has left. He holds on to them like a drowning man holds onto a rock. She took a hesitant step closer. There is more to this. The boy, Niels, he is my sister's son. Hazel's heart stopped. My sister, she died giving birth to him. Britta continued, her voice breaking. It was a hard birth. Before she passed, she made me promise. She made me promise to watch over him. She did not believe in the old ways, not like Aslak does. She was afraid of the ritual. She wanted her son to live no matter the cost. The pieces clicked into place, the sorrow in Britta's eyes, her desperate longing glances at the cabin. Aslak is my uncle, Britta explained, our father's brother. With my sister gone, he is the elder of our family. He decreed that the ritual must be performed. No one dared to defy him. To do so is to be cast out. So you let them take him? Hazel asked, a new wave of anger mixing with her pity. I had no choice, Britta cried, her voice cracking with anguish. But I did not leave him to die. I wrapped him in the warmest furs. I chose the most sheltered spot I could find. And I prayed. Not to the spirits of the mountain, but to your Christian God. I have seen the cross in the town. I prayed that someone like you, someone with a different kind of heart, would find him. Here was the twist Hazel had never imagined. The abandonment was not a unified act of a whole people. It was the decree of one fanatical traditionalist, enforced upon a grieving and powerless family. Britta hadn't been pleading with Hazel to stand down. She had been praying for a champion. Aslak will not give up, Britta warned, her voice dropping to a whisper again. The weather is turning. A great storm is coming. He will see it as a sign, a final judgment from the spirits. He will use the storm as cover. He will come for the boy. And this time, he will not ask. She pressed something small and cold into Hazel's hand. It was a leather pouch tied with a thin cord. This is rowan wood and bear fur for strength. Our old magic. Maybe it will help you. Without another word, Britta turned and fled, melting back into the shadows of the forest, leaving Hazel alone with the terrifying knowledge of the coming storm and the full weight of the promise Britta's sister had made. She was no longer just fighting for a nameless child. She was fighting for a mother's dying wish. The sky began to change the next day. The brilliant, sharp blue faded to a dull, bruised gray. The air grew heavy and still, a suffocating silence that was more ominous than the howling of any wind. The birds fell silent. Even Body seemed to feel it, pacing restlessly by the door, a low whine caught in his throat. The storm Britta had warned of was coming. Hazel could feel it in her bones, a primal dread that resonated with the land itself. She worked with a feverish intensity, securing the barn door, bringing in enough wood to last for days, and melting every container she had full of snow. She checked the action on her shotgun and her father's old Colt revolver, laying them out on the main table. The cabin became a fortress, a small island of defiance against the coming siege. All the while, she cared for Niels. She held him close, his small, warm body a comfort against the encroaching cold. She sang to him soft lullabies from her own childhood, her voice a thin thread of warmth in the growing gloom. He would watch her, his grey eyes so full of trust, it broke her heart. He was the calm at the center of her personal storm. The first flakes began to fall in the late afternoon. They were not the light, fluffy flakes of the last blizzard, but heavy, wet clumps that splattered against the window pane. Within an hour, the world was gone again, erased by a swirling, deafening curtain of white. The wind returned not with a moan, but with a furious, shrieking rage. It tore at the cabin, seeking a way in its voice, the voice of Aslak's angered spirits. Hazel lit every lamp she had, pushing back against the oppressive darkness. She sat in her rocking chair, the shotgun once again across her lap, Nils sleeping peacefully in his crate nearby. She listened. She waited. Hours crawled by. The storm was a physical assault, a relentless battery of wind and snow that shook the very foundations of the cabin. Hazel found herself drifting, her exhaustion a heavy weight. She must have dozed because a sudden violent crack jerked her awake. It wasn't the storm. It was the sound of splintering wood. From the back of the cabin, Body was already on his feet, barking not with his usual warning growl, but with a frantic, savage fury. Hazel's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed the shotgun and a lantern, her hands slick with sweat. They weren't coming from the front. They had used the storm's noise as cover, approaching from the rear where there was no window. She crept toward the back wall where she stored her supplies. The sound came again, a heavy thud against the logs, followed by the screech of wood being pried apart. They were breaking in. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She was one woman. Aslak had his younger, stronger follower. They would overpower her in seconds. She looked at Nils, still sleeping blissfully unaware. A wave of pure, primal rage washed through her, drowning the fear. They would not have him. She didn't scream. She didn't cower. She acted. With a surge of adrenaline, she heaved the heaviest piece of furniture she owned, a solid oak chest filled with her linens and her past, against the back wall. It wouldn't stop them for long, but it might buy her time. Then she did something unexpected. She didn't brace the front door. She unbarred it. She grabbed the revolver, leaving the larger shotgun behind, and snatched the sleeping Niels from his crib, wrapping him tightly in his furs. Holding him securely in the crook of one arm, the revolver in her other hand, she threw the door open and plunged out into the blizzard. The force of the wind was staggering. It stole her breath and blinded her with a disorienting swirl of snow. It was a desperate, insane gamble. To flee into the heart of the very storm Aslak believed was his ally. But her cabin was a trap. Out here in the chaos, in the whiteout, she had a chance. She was as much a creature of this land as they were. She knew its dips and rises, its treacherous gullies and sheltering overhangs. She could hear them now, shouting from inside the cabin, their voices distorted by the wind. They had broken through and found her gone. She didn't look back. She pushed forward, her only guide, the faint silhouette of the trees at the edge of the woods. The forest, usually a place of quiet solitude, was a nightmare of groaning branches and falling snow. She stumbled on Niels, held tight to her chest, his warmth a small comfort against the raging cold. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Behind her she heard a shout, closer this time, a beam of a lantern cut a swath through the blizzard, swinging wildly. They were following her tracks. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs aching. The snow was deep, a thick, clinging powder that fought her every step. She fell, landing hard on her side, twisting to protect Niels from the impact. He let out a startled cry. The lantern beam froze, pinning her in its light. Two figures emerged from the swirling snow, Aslak and the younger man, their faces grim and determined. "The spirits have delivered you to us, outsider," Aslak yelled over the wind. "End this now! Give me the boy!" Hazel scrambled backward, raising the revolver. The metal was so cold it burned her skin. "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice torn away by the gale. The younger man started toward her, a length of rope in his hand. "I'll shoot! I swear to God I will!" Her threat seemed to have no effect. They kept coming, confident in their numbers, in the righteousness of their cause. She was cornered, exhausted, and her doom was striding toward her through the snow. And then, from the trees to her left, a new sound. A low, guttural snarl that cut through the howl of the wind. Body. He had followed her. He exploded from the darkness, a grey blur of righteous fury, and launched himself not at the men, but at the lantern. He hit it with the full force of his body, sending it flying into a snowbank, plunging them all into near total darkness. The younger man yelled in surprise. In that one moment of confusion, Hazel saw her chance. But not to run. She saw the look on Aslak's face, illuminated for a second by the dying lantern. It wasn't just fanaticism, it was desperation. The face of a man, terrified of his world, disappearing. In that instant, she understood what Britta had tried to tell her. This wasn't about hate, it was about fear. Instead of running, she pushed herself to her feet and faced him. "You're wrong, Aslak," she shouted, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't know she possessed. "The spirits aren't angry. Look at him." She pulled back the furs from Niels' face. The child, awake now, wasn't crying. He was calm, his wide, stormy eyes looking around at the swirling chaos with a strange serenity. "You say a child must be strong to survive the storm." She continued her words, a challenge. "He has survived this, the worst of it, not in a sheltered thicket, but out here, in its very heart. If your tradition is a test of strength, then he has passed. He is the champion you were looking for." Aslak stared, mesmerized by the sight of the calm infant. The younger man was still trying to fend off Body, who was snarling and snapping, keeping him at bay. "This is not the way," Aslak insisted, but his voice had lost its iron certainty. A sliver of doubt had entered his eyes. "The old ways must bend, or they will break," Hazel yelled. "Is your tradition about the words or the meaning behind them? Is it about leaving a child in the snow? Or is it about finding the strength God gave them? He is strong, Aslak, stronger than any of you knew." Suddenly, the world seemed to tilt. A deep, groaning crack echoed from the mountain above them. It was a sound Hazel knew and feared. An avalanche. The storm had destabilized the massive buildup of snow on the high slopes. The younger man froze, his fight with Body, forgotten, his face turning pale with terror. He was standing in a small clearing directly in the path of a potential slide. "Move!" Hazel screamed, pointing up the slope. "To the rocks!" But he was paralyzed with fear. Aslak was looking up, his face a mask of horror. For all their knowledge of the mountain, they were caught. Without a second thought, Hazel shoved Niels into Aslak's arms. "Hold him," she commanded. The elder took the child automatically, his eyes wide with shock. Hazel lunged for the younger man, grabbing his thick hide coat and pulling with all her might. "Come on!" She dragged him, stumbling and resisting, toward a large outcropping of granite rocks 20 feet away, the only potential shelter. The rumbling grew louder, a deafening, terrifying roar that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. She threw the man behind the rocks and dove after him just as the first wave of snow hit. It was a river of white, a thundering, unstoppable force. It smashed through the trees where they had been standing, snapping ancient pines like twigs. The air was filled with a suffocating cloud of snow dust. Hazel pressed herself against the rock, shielding her head with her arms, as the world dissolved into a roaring white chaos. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then silence. A silence more profound and complete than anything she had ever experienced. Slowly, shakily, Hazel raised her head. The landscape was utterly changed. Where there had been a forest, there was now a smooth, sloping field of white, dotted with the splintered remains of trees. The younger man was staring, his mouth agape, his body trembling. He looked at Hazel, his eyes filled with a dawning awe. Hazel's gaze flew to where Aslak had been standing. He was safe. He had been just outside the main path of the slide. He stood, clutching Nils to his chest, staring at the path of destruction, then at Hazel. The child was still calm in his arms. She had saved his kinsman, an outsider, a woman. She had entrusted him, her sworn enemy, with the child he had come to take. She had shown a courage and a knowledge of the mountain that rivaled his own. She had proven her words with actions. The storm began to subside, the wind's shriek softening once more to a sigh. The snow thinned, and a pale light began to filter through the clouds. Aslak looked down at the child in his arms, then back at Hazel. The hardness in his face had crumbled, replaced by a look of profound, bewildered respect. The test was over. But it was not the child who had been tested. It was him. In the hushed aftermath of the avalanche, the four of them and Body made their way back to the damaged cabin. The silence between them was no longer hostile, but heavy with unspoken meaning. The younger man, whose name she learned was Kale, walked with his head bowed, occasionally stealing a humbled glance at Hazel. Aslak carried Nils, holding the cradleboard, with a reverence that was entirely new. The back wall of the cabin was a ruin of splintered logs, but the structure was sound. While Hazel worked to board it up as best she could, Aslak, to her astonishment, began to rebuild the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. Kale, after a moment's hesitation, started to gather the scattered firewood, stacking it neatly by the hearth. When the makeshift repairs were done and the fire was blazing, they sat in a strange temporary truce. Aslak finally relinquished Nils, placing the cradleboard gently into Hazel's arms. "He is a champion," Aslak said, his voice quiet, devoid of its earlier booming authority. He looked at Hazel, his dark eyes holding a complex mixture of remorse and wonder. "And so are you. You speak of the meaning behind the words. My ears were closed, but the mountain has opened them." He placed a hand over his heart. The tradition was meant to ensure our leaders were strong. But we became so obsessed with the form of the test, we forgot its purpose. Strength is not only enduring the cold, it is courage, it is compassion, it is protecting the tribe. You have protected one of our own. You have protected the future. He rose to his feet. "We will leave you in peace. The boy will remain with you until the spring thaw. He is safer here." It was a monumental concession, an overturning of centuries of law. When the paths are clear, we will return." With a solemn nod, he and Kyle departed, leaving as silently as they had come. Hazel was left in the quiet of her repaired cabin, the sleeping infant in her arms, a profound sense of disbelief washing over her. She had faced the storm, and somehow had found a calm harbor on the other side. The rest of the winter passed in a kind of dream. The threats ceased. Twice she found a haunch of cured reindeer meat left on her doorstep. Once a beautifully woven blanket of the softest wool. They were silent gifts, acknowledgments from the mountain people. Brita visited several times, her face now free of its constant sorrow. She would play with Niels, teaching Hazel Sámi lullabies, her quiet joy a balm to Hazel's soul. She learned that the community had been thrown into turmoil by the events of the storm. Aslak's authority had been shaken, and many of the younger generation, led by Brita, were calling for a re-examination of the old, harsher traditions. A quiet revolution was brewing, and Niels was its unwitting catalyst. Hazel watched Niels grow. He began to crawl, to pull himself up on the furniture. His first word, spoken with a toothless grin, was a babbling approximation of Boddy's name. The hole in Hazel's heart, the one that had driven her to this lonely valley, was being filled day by day by her love for this child. She knew with an aching certainty that when the spring came, she would have to give him back. He was not hers to keep, but a part of her would go with him when he left. The snows finally began to recede in late April. The valley awoke the brown earth, re-emerging, the first green shoots pushing through the soil. The air grew soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Hazel knew they would be coming soon. It happened on a bright, clear morning. Boddy gave a single, welcoming bark. Hazel stepped outside, her heart pounding. It was not three figures who approached, but the entire community. There were dozens of them, men, women, and children, all dressed in their finest embroidered clothes, and with them came the reindeer. Not one or two, but a great herd, their antlers forming a moving forest. They were leading them in a great silent procession directly toward her cabin. At their head walked Aslak, not with his staff of authority, but leading a magnificent white reindeer. Beside him was Brita, her face beaming, holding the hand of a frail elderly woman, with eyes as wise and ancient as the mountains themselves. This was the true elder, the matriarch Riston. They stopped before her. Niels, perched on Hazel's hip, gurgled with delight at the sight of the animals. It was Riston who spoke, her voice thin as dry leaves, but imbued with an undeniable power. "Hazel Sullivan," she said, her accent thicker and more lyrical than Aslak's. "Our people have a name for one who is not of our blood, but who shares our soul. Siva Olmosh, a spirit friend." She gestured to the procession. "We do not do this for outsiders. The procession of honor is for our greatest heroes, those who saved the tribe. You did not just save a child. You saved us from ourselves. You reminded us that the heart of our way is life, not death." Brita stepped forward, her eyes shining. "Niels is my blood. He will be raised among his people to know his language and his history, but he will also know you. You will be his Mwotka Eadni, his snow mother. You will always be a part of his life, a part of our family." Tears streamed down Hazel's face as she looked at the sea of faces, at the quiet dignity of the people and their animals. They were not taking Niels away. They were sharing him. She spent the day with them. They feasted, they sang, and they listened as she told them stories of her own world, just as they told her stories of theirs. Aslak, a changed man, sat with her, asking her questions with the humility of a student. As evening fell, it was time. With a pain that was both sharp and sweet, she handed Niels to Britta. He looked from his aunt to Hazel, his brow furrowed in confusion. Hazel knelt down, kissing his forehead. "Be a champion, little one," she whispered. She stood with Body at her side and watched them leave a river of people and reindeer, flowing back toward the high mountains, Niels's dark hair a tiny speck in their midst. Her cabin felt impossibly empty. The silence she had once sought had returned. But it was different now. It was not the silence of loneliness, but of peace. It was filled with the echoes of laughter, of song, and the soft padding of reindeer hooves. She was no longer hiding from the world. She had found her place in it, in a way she had never expected. She was Hazel Sullivan, the snow mother of the Sámi, and she was finally home. Hazel's incredible story is a powerful reminder that true strength isn't found in rigid adherence to the past, but in the courage to choose compassion. One woman, a single, abandoned child, and an unforgettable reindeer procession managed to bridge two worlds and change the heart of a community forever. It proves that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism don't happen on a battlefield, but in the quiet, desperate moments where one person decides to fight for the life of another. If this story of unlikely courage and cross-cultural connection moved you, please honor Hazel's legacy by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a powerful real-life drama, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We have many more tales of the unsung heroes of history coming soon, and you won't want to miss them.